Welcome to Becoming Church, the podcast where we discuss how the message and movement of Jesus is not just about becoming Christians, but about becoming the church. I'm your host, Kristen Muffler-Young, and I am extra excited today for two special reasons. First of all, the interview I'm about to share with you was an absolute dream. I want you to think about that person that you love from afar, the one who'd cause you to absolutely freak out if you met them, that person. Yeah, for me, that's my guest today. But before I introduce you, I want to give you some really exciting news, which is that the Becoming Church podcast has reached 10,000 downloads. I am so grateful for every listen, every share, every download. And so I want to thank you, our listeners, with a little present. From now through Sunday, March 10th, everyone who writes a review for Becoming Church will be entered to win an Amazon gift card. Yeah. You can use it to purchase a book you've learned about through an interview with the author on one of these episodes. You can use it for some new headphones to listen, or honestly, you can use it for something super unspiritual that will just make your life happier or easier. All you have to do is go to Apple Podcasts, even if that's not the platform where you usually listen to the show, and leave a review. Then, and this is the important part, send me an email at kristen@mosaicchurch.tv with a screenshot or your review username so I know which review is yours and how to contact you if you win. As soon as you do that, you will be entered. And listen, here's what I'm going to do. The more of you who leave a review, the higher the gift card amount will be. So I don't know, grab your spouse's phone or your friend's phone and make sure they leave a review too. The direct link to leave a review is in the show notes below. Thank you in advance for all of the listens and for sharing your love of Becoming Church with the world. Now, without any further ado, my guest today is someone who unknowingly, as a stranger, changed and strengthened my faith. She kind of saved me when I thought that I was not only losing my faith, but also my entire sense of self. Her name is Sarah Bessey, and you may know her from her books like Jesus Feminist or Out of Sorts, or her work with Evolving Faith. If this is your first introduction to Sarah, you are in for a treat as we dive deeper into one of my favorite quotes of hers, which is this: "If you get to the end of your life with the same beliefs and opinions you had at the beginning, you're doing it wrong." Here's my conversation with Sarah Bessey. All right, Sarah Bessey, I have to both name you. I told you this in the email. You will forever be Sarah Bessey to me. Welcome to Becoming Church.
Oh, thank you so much. I'm so happy to be here. I am so excited to spend some time with you and with everybody who's listening. And yeah, there's not a single time I don't get the full name treatment. I get the full Sarah Bessey. That always makes me happy.
Good.
It's been true my whole life, actually. Even my maiden name, which was Stiles, I was always called Sarah Stiles. And I wonder if it's because there were so many Sarahs in us, for us Gen Xers.
Like I
was always like one of like four.
Yeah.
And maybe that's why people do it. It's just
I was always
that habit.
Kristen
We were all Sarahs or Jennifers or Kristen.
Right. Oh my gosh.
We had 5 names in the 70s and 80s. We had 5.
Yes. I was always Kristen M. So we gave my girls very unique names. Like I have a Marley and a Margot because we were like, we don't want you to have to be, Marley Y and Margot Y like I had to do. But even now I married into a very common last name and Kristen Young is everywhere. And so now I've just worked that maiden name back in there. And so now I'm 3 named. I'm Kristen Muffler-Young.
There you go. We'll take it.
Yes. Well, Sarah Bessey, before we jump into it with your book and all the things we're going to talk about today, you shared on your Instagram that you are in launching this book that is coming out on Tuesday. Very excited. That you have all kinds of feelings about it. And so you are stress knitting. And so I have to ask you, did you knit that sweater that you're wearing right now?
I didn't actually. Usually I am wearing something that I've made and I've been inflicting it on. I've stopped inflicting it on other poor innocent bystanders. My youngest daughter, so we have 4 children.
Yes.
My older 3 are teenagers. And so they've like gently been like, we're good with the hand knits.
Yes. Thanks, Mom.
My youngest is still quite game. So I still keep dressing her up in it. But no, it is, I started knitting when my son was born. So that would be about 15 years ago.
Okay.
And I'm not like an amazing knitter. I'm just very enthusiastic.
Yeah.
And I don't know, I find it does that meditative thing of like turning your mind off a little bit, or
Yep.
just stopping the hamster wheel for a hot second. And
Yeah.
that feels good.
Yeah. Keeping your hands busy to like get that nervous energy out of your brain.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Well, I know a lot of our listeners are familiar with you already, but you are an author and you've written, this is your fifth book. Is that right?
Yes. Yeah, it
It
is.
is.
That's crazy to me.
I think it
My
is.
gosh.
So I've been a fan of your work from the first line of Out of Sorts, which was the first book that I read of yours. And you wrote at the very beginning of Out of Sorts, you wrote, once upon a time, you had it all beautifully sorted out. Then you didn't.
Story of our lives, eh?
Yes, right? I think I put that book down and cried right then. I was like, one line it, because you had figured out a way to name like what I hadn't found words for. As I was just beginning my journey of really taking a hard look in the mirror and saying, maybe I didn't actually know everything about God or the church and the Bible. And I find so much grace. You hold people, your readers, in like this tender, motherly almost way. And I would say that this is actually your sweet spot of like holding the middle space for people who have doubt and uncertainty, but also are longing for something more. And so how did you find yourself? This is a very tricky, I know it can be a very lonely place. How did you find your voice, I guess, in this position?
That's an interesting. Well, thank you. I mean, I think that's the hope.
Yes.
That is the hope. I think I found my way there because maybe it was a little bit by accident, but I mean, me being me, I'm going to always point and say like, well, I think it was a spirit, right? And
Yes.
so you can take the girl out of the charismatic church, but you can't take some of that language away from me ever. So
Yes.
I think one of the things that emerged for me, I think because my own first experiences with deconstruction happened at a time when there wasn't this kind of support and community and conversation. There weren't books, there weren't podcasts.
Yeah.
And so for someone like me who was, 25 years ago, was very first kind of embarking on some of these things, it felt profoundly lonely. And I mean, there's a few different ways that people kind of embark on this season of your life, which I've now learned at this point is incredibly normal. No matter how much we try to pathologize it and make it into this big, scary, terrible thing,
Sure.
that it's actually like a very normal part of spiritual formation. And if you're paying attention, you're going to kind of end up here eventually in some way, shape, or form.
Yeah.
But at the same time, there was this element for me of like, I entered so much into like a burn it down phase, just flailing, and made so many mistakes. And I think probably some of the only mercies that I can point to during that time is that, social media didn't exist maybe at quite the same level and scope that it did then. And so I think
you didn't have a place for your ragey rants.
Exactly. And so, I mean, I was blogging at the time, but like nobody was reading it or paying much attention to it at all. I think I was blogging for like 7 years before anybody noticed, which is a great mercy now. But there was this sense for me of like, what did I need then? And what would have served me well? And I think that that's maybe where I continue to kind of circle, or maybe why I have, a bit of a tenderness or a heart for people who find themselves kind of at that threshold, is what are the things that served me well? What are the things that emerged over the years and years of navigating the wilderness, and of, what are the things that I gathered or learned that maybe would make the path a little bit easier for someone else, but holds that kind of room for both people's different stories than mine, and also the fact that they may end up somewhere very different than myself, and what are the things that would endure even there. And so I think that might be part of the origin point. I remember like even when Rachel Held Evans and I were starting Evolving Faith, we were kind of like almost joking that we were creating the thing we wish we would have had, at the time. And so maybe that's part of it.
Yeah. Oh, that's so great. And Rachel, man, what a legacy that she is still living through you and her. I know her sister and Evolving Faith and her books. I've got her books also changed my life. And so, yes, just I want to encourage you that it's still happening and still going on. I know that you must miss her terribly. But thank you for bravely going on. I mean, I know, like you said, now there are podcasts and books and videos, and there are more people deconstructing, but I think it can still be a very lonely place. I think it still takes a lot of courage, especially as someone who I would say is leading the way in this, to continue to go out there and face all of the scrutiny and the criticism that I know that you face along the way. So thank you for that. Now, you use the word deconstruction. And I do think that it's the best word that we have. But I also know that deconstruction means 100 different things to 100 different people. And depending on maybe what theological stance they have, it's either a great thing or it's a scary thing, or it's like, yes, great, do it. Like you said, if you're paying attention, you're going to get there. I agree with you. But there are also people who are like, this is, antichrist and all of this stuff. So what does it mean to you when you talk about deconstructing?
Yeah, I think it's one of those words that has almost ceased to have any meaning beyond what the person deploying it means by it. Because like you listen to some folks and it's a lot of, pearl clutching and accusations of heresy and apostasy and all sorts of things, which I'm pretty Jesus-y for an apostate. So there we go. But there's this sense for me when I understand the limits of words like deconstruction and why people struggle with it. I agree with you. I think it's helpful. I think that there's words, and whatever words maybe are helpful to someone who's entering into kind of this season or this stage of faith or this moment kind of reckoning. Whatever language serves you is fine, and you're able to use it if it's deconstruction. But if it's not, because it carries a lot of baggage for you, I know a lot of people like, reimagine or reconstruction or, which even though that may not fully understand. For me, I've really grown to love and usually tend towards the phrase evolving faith.
Yeah.
And I think part of the reason why is that it allows me to make room for including everything that came before as well. And treating that with tenderness, even if I leave it behind, that it allows me to hold room for some of the complexities. One of the things that I remember really clearly at our very first Evolving Faith gathering was actually from Rachel. And she was talking about an evolving faith being a faith that has adapted in order to survive.
Yeah.
That it's not a matter of being more evolved than everybody else or like thinking you finally arrived. Like for me, I think one of the big dangers sometimes when you find yourself in this season is thinking that you just get to trade one set of answers for a new and different and better set of answers.
Yes.
And that's not actually what the Spirit is up to here. And so there's this sense of like, here's what that is going to. Did I just set off fireworks?
I'm not sure what it said. You said the Spirit and fireworks and like snow and stars came out. I don't know how you did that.
Listen, that was the anointing, Kristen. I would just like,
Wow. That was amazing. That was amazing.
Incredible. I don't even know what I was saying now, but there's a sense for me, like in terms of an evolving faith that allows you to do what like Richard Ward talks about, like transcend and include, right?
Yeah.
Which I think means as well, it speaks to the point that it's not just pulling things apart, that it's growing into maybe who you were meant to be all along, growing into it, a wider, more expansive, more beautiful view of God and of people. I think that there's a little more room there.
You, in the book, you referred to deconstruction as pulling at the accepted truths to tease out the thing under the thing in an effort toward deeper truth and understanding. And so I love that idea of, I think a lot of times people do tend to go, okay, well, and let's be honest. It is the conservatives who are deconstructing. It is the people who grew up in fundamentalism and legalism and all of the black and white. That's who's deconstructing. I mean, right? Like,
yeah. And one thing I've been surprised by is the fact that it's not restricted to one age group. One of the things that I find really, really interesting to me is I think that sometimes people will look at it and point, and, I think especially when we were kind of very first starting to name and speak to some of these things 10 years ago, like we were, people were like, oh, that's young people. Young people are doing this thing. No, there are so many people that I've talked to in their, in my stage of life, but also in their 50s and 60s and 70s who are experiencing something very similar. And I think it does kind of transcend age, but I think the thing that people have ended up finding is just like there's got to be more than this. And what does it mean to be outside of like this teeny tiny little box I was given or constructed for God? And what's on the other side of that?
And it's such a process too, which is why I love that you continue to write about this. It's not like, hey, one day I think about something and then I change my mind and everything is great. And now I think there's a tendency to want to do that, to want to go, well, I used to be this. And so because the unknowing in the middle can be so uncomfortable, I'm just going to flip to the other side for a little bit, because then that's where more answers are. But I feel like it's this pendulum swing, right? Of like, maybe you go there, but eventually we come back to the middle and find that like maybe Jesus has been there the whole time.
I mean, that was definitely my experience. I think sometimes maybe we have this tendency to want to like almost trade one kind of fundamentalism for another kind.
Yeah.
And I don't think that's really what we're after. I don't think that's really what the Spirit is after when it comes to these sorts of things. I think there's bigger invitations that are waiting for us. But I think that that's one of those things that maybe surprises people at times, is understanding that you start sometimes with, wanting to talk about what you really think about atonement, you know? And then all of a sudden you like run flat into like, what is the actual nature and character of God? And I mean, I know for me, like when I very first began deconstructing, not very first, but I think this is probably within the first 10 years of that experience. I remember having this moment really clearly. I think actually I wrote about it in Out of Sorts now that I'm thinking about it out loud. But I talked about how I was sitting at the kitchen table and I was reading the Gospels, because I had hit this point in my faith where I was like, I do not want to be called a Christian anymore. Whatever is happening in this story and with these people, I don't want it anymore. I cannot identify with this. I do not want to be aligned with this any longer. This isn't language that fits me. And so I began calling myself a follower of Jesus instead, because to me, that was a huge difference. Spoiler alert, it's not. But for me, it gave me some room in my own heart, right? And so there was this moment for me where I look back on it and I almost laugh now, Kristen, because I had this moment of being like, well, if I'm going to call myself a follower of Jesus, I should probably figure out who he is and what that means. Because I had the realization that I was really good at what, there was this writer on the internet back in like the early aughts named Michael Spencer. He used to go by the name The Internet Monk. And he used to call it churchianity. Like I was really good at churchianity, but I was not so good at the Christianity part of it. And so for me, I did what I think a lot of, charismatic Protestants would do. You go back to the Bible, right? No matter what. And so I did. I went and spent just years in the Gospels, just really sitting at the feet of Jesus and letting myself wrestle with these stories and letting myself get angry even, or feeling like I didn't understand, certain responses or certain moments, and wanting to learn and understand more what it meant. But I remember this day in particular, sitting at the kitchen table in our little duplex in BC. My husband was at the kitchen sink washing some veggies from the garden or something. And I remember I was reading the Sermon on the Mount in Luke 6. And I got to the end of it. And I remember like slamming my Bible shut, like almost in anger, and looking up at Brian and being like, I would have followed this guy. I would have. No wonder people dropped everything to chase after this. No wonder it has reset whole lives. Like this is a thing you could build a life on. This is a thing you could build a whole way of being in the world on. And I almost felt ripped off, right? In some ways, right? And after, at that time, almost 25, 30 years of being part of, things that you would characterize as being within that lane. And so I think
why didn't I know this Jesus?
Right. Exactly. It was just so much more beautiful, inclusive, and welcoming and true than I probably ever could have imagined. And I think that is proven true for me. Everything that I ever hoped was true about God, everything I ever hoped was true about Jesus turned out to barely be a glimmer of the goodness that exists here.
Well, and that might answer or be part of the answer for my next question. But you mentioned, the whole burn it down, right? Like some people deconstruct maybe with the intention of, I'm going to do this so that I can burn it down once I disprove all the things, or some people just kind of land there accidentally. But I don't get that from you. So I want to know, what do you think, or what do you hope is on the other side of deconstruction, or for people that walk through the wilderness, what do you hope they find on the other side of it?
That is a good question. I think I'm less concerned about like particular outcomes, mainly because I think one of the things that I have landed on for now is how deeply we are loved by God, and how that is the truest thing in the universe, and that you can't outwander God's love, that there's nowhere you can go where you are out beyond the reach of God's love. And I think that that's one of the things that maybe is one of the first things we need to learn in order to navigate the wilderness well, is is to deal with the very real fears we have of getting it wrong.
Mm-hmm.
Like somehow there's this super high, steep price that you pay, that you're at risk of going to hell or sending other people to hell.
Yeah.
Or you're like, you know, like just like the stakes are so high because you view God as like punitive and judgmental and angry, looking for the slightest thing to hold over your head. And I mean, just that level of cruelty and pettiness and narrowness, which when we begin to deconstruct and you're like, well, why do I think that? And where did that come from?
Mm-hmm.
And so for me, I think where we're going to land on the other side of this, I think my greatest hope for people is to really understand and live within the love of God in that way. No matter what opinions we may hang on to or not, no matter all the ways that we are wrong about some things or growing in others, or the ways that maybe in 20 years we'll look back on and be like, well, that was a nightmare. You know,
that was wrong too.
much like how all of us are looking back at purity culture right now, being like, well, that was a nightmare. You know?
Oh my gosh. Yes.
You know, like whatever it is, right? I can look back on all these moments. I think that what's waiting for us maybe on the other side is some of that healing and that wholeness and that goodness that maybe even would look a lot more like that abundant life that Jesus talked about. No matter, and that there's room for mistakes. There's room for getting it wrong. There's room for living that out. And what does it look like to love God and love people in whatever life we have right now as we're walking it out?
Yeah. And like you mentioned, finding that everything you hoped was true is actually true. You know, the things the parts of God and Jesus that we do love, that we are like, I really hope that no matter what else shakes down, this still stays the same, that does actually stay the same.
Exactly.
You know, or is better even than we ever thought or were ever taught that it could be.
Mm-hmm.
Do you have a particular moment? Was there like a particular topic or question or moment or thought that really kind of started you on your like deconstruction, rethinking process?
You know, I think like for a lot of people, it almost ended up being like this thicket of things, right? They're all kind of tangled together. I don't know if you remember, like when my kids were little, we used to read like the Berenstain Bears books. And there's this Berenstain Bears books where the kids are supposed to be cleaning up their room. And they just shove it all in the closet. And they keep putting it in the closet, keep putting it in the closet. And then sure enough, in the picture, it's like the closet door is straining. It's bowed out. You can see that it's about to burst. And then sure enough, in come the parents and the whole thing flies open and away goes. That's kind of how it felt. Okay. I'm just being like, I kept throwing everything in there for a really long time. And you can do that for a while. You know, I think that sometimes when we find ourselves at this threshold of the wilderness, we often can think that we have like two options. And our options are to either burn it all down, which I definitely did that. Or we think it's that you double down. You just pretend you're fine. Put your fingers in your ears. I'm going to go to every Bible study, everything I've ever knew. You know, I'm going to do it harder. I'm going to do it even better. I'm going to do it like whatever it is. And so that's kind of what that season is. And then eventually you come to this point where you just simply can't keep that closet door closed any longer. You can't keep those things hidden anymore. And so for me, I mean, there were questions around like women and women's voices and experiences in the church. And it was things like, you know, patterns of behavior and sin and brokenness and things that I saw in churches and leadership. And this was even before the Me Too movement and, you know, a lot of the church abuse scandals that have come to light in the last number of years, which talk about a light that needed to be turned on. And so, but then there were other things even happening like geopolitically. I remember like the Iraq war and the 9/11 attacks being huge for me because it was the first time that I remember looking around at kind of the context that I was in and just being like, this isn't how I'm approaching this. This doesn't feel good and right to me. And so I know that there's a lot of folks even now, I think especially since 2016 in the United States, where we have seen that kind of like geopolitical reckoning of being like, well, I don't, this doesn't match up with what I know about Jesus and what I hope is true about the world and about how we move through the world. So I have a lot of tenderness for people who find themselves there because of those reasons. And I mean, I think especially because faith and politics can be really entwined for a lot of folks as well.
Right.
But then there were even like smaller things for me, like, well, not smaller, they were huge in my life, but more like ordinary sorrows. Okay. You know, like my husband and I experienced a lot of miscarriages and I came out of the prosperity gospel, word of faith, charismatic church where like we didn't know what to do with unanswered prayers.
Right.
We didn't know what
prayed and you had the faith and God was just supposed to give you the desires of your heart.
Yeah. The amount of shame I think that you experience in those circles when you are someone who's experiencing loss or sickness or challenge or
Yeah.
struggle.
Yeah.
Because you have such a high view of God, it means that it must be your fault. Right.
Right.
And so there's a huge amount of
the
like guilt and
original
shame to that.
gaslighting is like, hey,
Exactly.
it is your fault that this happened because
Absolutely. You lacked
clearly
faith,
you
you didn't
have
pray
enough.
well enough, you
Yes.
didn't, whatever else. Right. So all those things are all kind of happening. They're all in the closet.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that was what ended up kind of being the thing that released it, was actually that moment. One of my last miscarriages that I had. Actually, I had one more after that, but
That was it.
but near the end of all of that, where it was just like, you know what I'm done.
Yeah.
I'm done pretending anymore. I'm done acting like I have all the answers. I'm done acting like I understand any of this. I'm done acting like I'm not furious.
Yeah.
Which I think is a hard thing for a lot of women, especially of my generation, to admit that you're so angry.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, even
and
allowing,
God.
Exactly.
And
allowing yourself to have room for that.
Right. Yes.
That was the moment where I was like, all right, well, we're doing this.
Yeah. All right. Well, look, you've helped so many people along the way. So it's awesome. Well, you have a book coming out called Field Notes for the Wilderness, and there's a guide, a journal, right?
Yeah, there is actually. It's my first time doing that, actually, Kristen, which
That's exciting.
have to admit, I was kind of skeptical about it. And then I started working on it and I was like, oh, this is really great, because I think one of the things that I think me being me, I'm not a super prescriptive person.
Uh-huh.
And it's a struggle for me to be like, well, this worked for me, so it's 100% the life path you should follow.
Yeah.
And so for me, it was allowing there to be like a recontextualization for people who are encountering, maybe here's the things that have served me. Here's the practices that I've found really helpful. Here's the ways that I would make your path a little bit easier if I could.
Yeah.
But this gave room for you to say and name your own life and your own experiences and to point to some of those things and to even honor them. And so for me, I ended up really actually loving that experience, which surprised me.
That's great. That's great. So people can just read along, do the guidebook, I guess, as they're reading along, and then it just gives them space to collect
to process, to process and to share and to write and the nice thing too is like not everybody loves to journal or write like I do, and so I think it's even got room for things like, if you want to do it in a small group or a discussion, or I know one friend who likes to like record them as almost voice memos, like for herself. Or to cool. Create art along the way. Another friend did. Yeah. And so, it's kind of been fun to see how people will interact with. There's more than one way to do it. That's for sure.
Like anything else. Yes. All right. Well, I want to ask you a couple practical questions. And so I've kind of got three people, as I'm air quoting, in mind. So for the person who finds themselves maybe right now out in the wilderness, didn't realize that's where they were, maybe didn't realize even that they were deconstructing. They were just in this place of like, I don't feel like myself, or this faith doesn't fit anymore. Outside of reading your book, what is something that you would encourage them to do?
That's a good question. I think, there's a number of things I think that are helpful that we've talked about already, like, resetting even our understanding of God and having some room for the love and the presence and the goodness of God. I think that's probably one of them. I think another thing that I would want, and this is maybe hard to do at this stage. So maybe it's one that people have to almost grow into in some ways. Mm-hmm. But one of the things that has really helped me move out of the anger and the burn it down and the whatever else is to begin to name what I'm for instead of just what I'm against.
Oh, I love that so much.
And I think that's one of the things that has ended up really serving me well, but it has almost fixed and reset kind of some of those broken things around me, or that I've experienced in my own life, of just being able to say, it is actually really good and important to name what you're against, right? Mm-hmm. Which I think is actually the first part of that, because I think especially for, there's those of us who have, I don't know what the word is that I'm looking for, but almost like sanctified pretending to be fine.
Yeah.
Right. Or acted like somehow that's the more spiritual response, to act like your feelings weren't hurt, or your heart isn't broken, or you don't have questions, when it's like, I'm sorry, you don't love God and people better by pretending to be less human than you are.
I think we were taught that it makes us selfish to have emotions, or to have our own thoughts or opinions that don't go with the flow.
Absolutely. So being able to name that you're against things, or be like, you know what, not this, whatever this is, It's not that.
Yeah.
I think that's actually a really good and healthy and important stage of those things. I think the thing that I would encourage people practically to do is to keep pressing into whatever you're against until you find your for. You know, like, what is it that you're actually for? You know, like one example I talked about in the book was even around like money, which it was such a weighted topic for someone like myself coming out of like the prosperity gospel, you know, TV preacher kind of lane.
Yeah.
Where I was like, well, not that. Right? Like, we're not going to be taking, you know, checks from old ladies, and we're not going to be telling people that God owes them money because they gave stuff. Like this whole view of money and looking at things is just wild.
Yeah.
And so not that. But then the thing that I needed to rebuild and relearn was, what does it look like to be for generosity? What does it look like to be for good stewardship? What does it look like to actually embody those things? So yes, not this, but then what is it that I'm turning towards? And I think that that's some of the rhythm that we end up almost learning in the wilderness, is that you're not just turning away from something, you have to be turning towards something.
Yeah.
And what is it that you're hoping for? And so then to me, that gives you a path for what are your hopes? What is it that you dream about? What is the thing that you long to see? And I think oftentimes we find our calling kind of almost hiding at that intersection of what we're against and what we're for, or what we're angry about and what brings us joy.
Yeah.
And
what
so
lights us
that's
up.
kind of a good sweet spot, I think, to lean into. And so if people find themselves kind of stuck or turning around and around and around on the rage and the anger and the being against, that's valuable and important work, and I wouldn't want to take away from people to do. But I think that the invitation then is to begin to lift up your head and say, okay, then what am I for? What is it that I actually want to see happen?
Well, that goes back to the ultimate hope of Jesus, right? Instead of just forever raging and finding a commonality of against the other that we hate, what goodness can we find in this, and then use that as our motivation or to stay rooted in. All right. So for people who maybe themselves are not in this place, and maybe they don't even understand deconstruction, but they have a family member or a friend, or maybe even a church member who is in a season of wandering, how can they be supportive of those people in their lives, even if they don't fully understand what deconstruction is?
I think I love that question, like with my whole heart. I think that that's one of the things that we're so scared of.
Yeah.
In the moments when you very first kind of cross that threshold into the wilderness, is, you know, the stakes. You just do. You know that the currency of belonging is fitting in and not asking questions and not rocking the boat. And so it is terrifying to be the person who steps out of that. And oftentimes it's the person we least expect, right? And so I think that one of the things pointing back for me, because I was one of the first ones in my family of origin, and even in my marriage and in the spaces that I was in, to kind of really vocally walk through this. There were two things that I remember really, really helping me. The first one was something that my dad did for me, was that he used to send me, like he still does actually. He sends me like passages of scripture when he prays for me in the morning.
That's awesome.
I know. I
So
still
sweet.
to this day, Kristen, feel like I am walking on the floors of prayers that my dad has, and my mom as well have prayed over me for my whole life. But one of the things that I remember them saying, when I was like in the most, like, I not only do I think I'm done, I think I'm incredibly done. Like it just, and completely rejecting this thing that we had given our lives to. I remember him saying to me, that he wasn't afraid for me, because if I was earnestly seeking God, that he had full confidence that I would find exactly what I needed and exactly what God had for me, even if it looked so different than what he had found. And just him having that room for my life and my choices and my faith to look different from his, but not be less than, was a huge exhale for me. To just be like, well, he's not going anywhere, and my mom's not going anywhere. And not everybody gets to have that story, because oftentimes that is the most tender and most painful part of deconstruction, is what's happening sometimes with your family of origin. So I think that permission to say, go keep searching, go keep looking, and know that I am okay with you being different than me. That was huge for me. And then the other thing actually was in relationship with my husband, because I went through this massive deconstruction at a time when he was in ministry. And I mean, it reset our whole life. Like it reset everything about his work, his vocation, everything about our location where we lived, everything got reset because of this. And I remember him just being like, just not afraid for me.
Yeah.
And I think even that reminder, no matter how angry or certain or flailing people look, oftentimes the thing that's hiding underneath it is a lot of insecurity and longing and hope and even heartbreak. And so to be someone in their life who is consistently a voice saying, I love you, I'm
Mm-hmm.
not afraid of you or for you.
Mm-hmm.
And it's going to be okay. Like I'm here. I'm not going anywhere just because of this.
Yeah.
Right. We didn't marry right opinions. We married each other.
Right.
And so, having room for that was huge for me. And so I think that that's one of the things that maybe has informed some of my work in this lane in all these years since, has been wanting to be that kind of non-anxious presence that's saying that you're loved,
Yeah.
that you don't have to be afraid, that you can
Yeah.
keep living into what you're learning and how you're growing and what you're pulling out and what you are adding back in, or all these things that are part of just being a person,
Yeah.
without being afraid that you're going to lose yourself or lose God. And even if that happens, you're still held within that sort of love, and there's nothing to be really panicking about, I suppose.
Mm-hmm. I think that's why your work is so important too, and why I cried talking to you before we started the interview, because for me that was, we did not have a shared experience there. And I think a lot of people don't have that experience, and a lot of people do deconstruct at the cost of losing very
Absolutely.
important relationships. And loss doesn't always mean they're completely cut out of your life, but it means that it's different. The whole dynamic has changed. It means
It
your
does.
conversations are different. And that can be really painful. And so I appreciate that that's the stance that you've taken, because I know there are a lot of people that didn't have that physically within their, hemisphere, but being able to have it in words and know that there are other people out there is so beautiful. It's the gift of time, but also of trust,
Mm.
right? Like,
Yeah.
I trust you, but also, and even more importantly, I trust Holy Spirit talking to you.
Mm.
That to me is the biggest thing, is I'm like, I understand if you don't agree with me, you don't want to, we don't believe like 100% the same things. That's fine. But like, can you just trust God? Can you just trust that Holy Spirit is actually speaking to me and working in my life? And I think that is the missing piece a lot of times when people get scared of friends and family members who are deconstructing.
Absolutely, it is. Absolutely, it is. And I think that that's one of the things maybe that we have to make our peace with really early in this process, is knowing that we will be misunderstood and
Yeah.
misrepresented.
Yeah.
And even on those things and in those spaces and places and moments or communities where we once had, perhaps even a tremendous amount of belonging.
Yeah.
Those are big losses.
And identity too,
Yeah.
depending. I mean, if it's a family relationship, a parent relationship, there's so much at Mosaic, at our church. We're really, really about like, you don't have to believe with us to be with us. And so
Mm.
we're very much trying to create this culture of like, you can believe in hell or not believe in hell. We're not going to get into it, but you can be here. You can think Adam and Eve were real people, or you can think that they were not. And it doesn't matter. Like, just,
Yeah.
and so we're just trying to collect people along the way that just want to run towards Jesus and get to know God better, and kind of
Mhm.
let go of needing to know the things that we will literally never know on this side of heaven,
Yes. That is so true. That is so
Uh,
true. But it does require a lot of generosity.
yeah.
And it requires, being able to almost embody that gentleness, but also even the self-control of the spirit, right?
Yeah.
To be able to hold that sort of complexity and nuance and
Hmm.
room for people's
Hmm.
differences, to understand that your story is not the only story.
Right.
That's hard for
And
some folks to
it's not the
understand.
right way. What we believe is not the right thing. We don't have the answer. It's just, yeah, you got to be comfortable with with that place.
You do. And I
You
think that's
know?
one of the things that maybe surprised me the most, when I very first started kind of getting more into some of the background or the science, the research behind some of these spiritual formation, paths or whatever else comes along, is that most of our churches have been set up to really function well when we're in that stage of literalism,
Hmm.
right? They're
Right.
set up for the answer. They're set
Right.
up for the system to be like, if this, then that. if you do believe this, then this will happen. If you do this, then that will happen. If you do that, then God help you, this is what's going to happen. Right. And so the idea of being in a different stage spiritually, that has room for complexity and nuance, and has room for differences, has room for, the universality of God's love and the boundarylessness of it. That's a hard thing for a church to navigate, because it's a hard thing for people to get their head around, that that's an okay space to be in.
Yeah.
Which is what makes what you guys are doing at Mosaic so rare and so beautiful, but also so hard sometimes for people, to say, okay, we're going to live in this really colorful space instead of in the black and white. Okay.
Right.
Let's do that.
Where there are no answers necessarily.
Right.
I mean, not no answers, but do you know what I mean? Yeah.
Absolutely.
All right. Well, as a pastor, Sarah, as someone whose job is church, as someone who still very much believes in the future of the church and what it has the potential to be and what it's supposed to be, what can I do? What can other church leaders do to make the church a safe place for people again?
I love that question. And I love that you're thinking in that direction. It says a lot about you all and about you, Kristen.
Thank you.
One of the things that we've run into in some of our conversations at Evolving Faith. So my friend Jeff Chu co-led Evolving Faith with me for a number of years after Rachel passed away.
Yeah.
And one of the things that he used to always kind of caution me on is that we're not actually called to create safe space. That you're not going to be able to create a space that is totally devoid of discomfort or disagreement or someone else's different story or whatever else. That, of course, does not mean that a church should not be like physically actually safe. Like, I'm not talking about things like, around looking after our kids, looking after our teenagers, and looking after the women in our churches, because that is a whole other thing. But in this particular way, he would always encourage me to look more towards sanctuary and less towards words like safety. And I think that was because for him, and with his own social location and his experience and whatever else, it's like even sanctuary is a lot. And being able to create those spaces where people feel loved, where they are allowed to be in process, where you don't have to have all the answers yet, where you feel a sense of belonging and permission, but also even of joy. Again, I think that's one of the things that maybe sometimes we lose in all of this is the reclamation of joy and happiness and loving the world and loving our lives and loving each other better. The whole totality of being a person, as opposed to just like this loose collection of opinions that you've stapled into a binder. Like that's just not what it is. And so I think that notion of sanctuary has really drawn me in terms of whether it's an intentional faith community or it's within our personal relationships, what does it look like to create that kind of respite or feast in the wilderness for people, even if it's just for a short period of time, and then they move on to whatever God has for them next or wherever their journey takes them next. This was a space where they took a deep breath and they did not feel kind of the weight, of some of those things. And so I think that those are good questions to be asking. And I think that those are places that you've managed to carve out, even as a community, to be able to lean into.
I love that. That's beautiful. And I'm getting emotional again over here because I think that's something that I did not expect in ministry, was to feel kind of like an evolving door of loss of people. And Charlotte also is a very, very transient city. So we have all kinds of people that move into Charlotte and then go on to something else. And it continues to not amaze me, because now I've learned that this is how God created me, and I love people hard and fast, and I just have to trust that He's going to keep putting my heart back together over and over again. But that idea that you said of, even if we can be sanctuary for them for a moment to take a breath, like it's okay if they go on to something else, even within Charlotte, if they go on to another church, if they go on to another community. I just have to be able, and we as pastors have to be able to just sit back and go, okay, but we were faithful to what we were supposed to do while we were allowed to hold them or to have them,
Exactly.
So,
and I think that stands for something, and it matters, right? I think
does,
especially when we get on the other side a few years later, like I look back at communities where my path crossed for like a brief moment in time. And I have such gratitude, you know, for those spaces, even if maybe they weren't a great fit for the long term, or they weren't where I needed to be for 20 years.
Right.
They're probably glad to see the back of me too. So that's fine. There's this sense of like, yeah, while we were together, we loved each other well, and we can bless each other even as we release for whatever's coming next. I remember Dr. Shaniqua Walker Barnes at Evolving Faith one year saying that by its very nature, we're going to be a people on the move. And even that permission of like, you're allowed to keep growing, you're allowed to keep changing, you're allowed to keep finding and cultivating belonging wherever you find it, and relearning how to love God and love people.
Yeah, I love it. Well, Field Notes for the Wilderness comes out on Tuesday. It's available for pre-order, and we will link it all up. What is different about this book than the other books that you've given us?
Oh, that's a great question. I think it's maybe a little bit more similar to my first two books, which were Jesus Feminist and Out of Sorts, which you mentioned. In a lot of ways, it deals with kind of like a specific theological issue, but I mean, there's obviously a lot of memoir and narrative and story kind of within it. And I think that it's been a fun thing to return to that for me, to have that kind of structure or format again. I think too, like one of the things that's maybe a bit different about this one is even the notion of me like putting forth things like practices or principles or whatever else. That's never really been kind of my lane, as you know. And so for me, being able to say, okay, if I was sitting across from someone who is just at the very beginning stages of this, what are the things I wish I would have known? What are the practices or the principles or even postures, maybe is a better word, that are good to kind of tuck into your back pocket? And I think I was thinking a little bit about like, so I live in Calgary, Alberta, which is right at the Rocky Mountains. So we spend a lot of time out in the mountains. And like this notion of like field guides or field notes that you kind of have, like where they're always a little bit ratty. They're always tucked in your back pocket. It's less like, you know, if this, then that, as it is like, watch out for this and keep an eye for this. And here's the path to kind of walk. But, you know, you could also go this way, you know, like whatever. There's a little bit more of a conversational invitation to exploration within it. And I think that that's kind of what I was hoping for with this one, was that it would actually be kind of like gathering up everything since Out of Sorts in particular, you know, which I wrote 10 years ago, and saying, all right, so here's these ideas, here's this stage of life, here's this moment you found yourself at. Here's everything that I think I've learned, and here's what I think would help you and serve you well. And we'll see. Yeah. Well, I have been I can't wait to read the rest of it. I just like sit at night and I've been going through it and I love it so much. I'm so excited. I'm so excited. Everyone should read it. Yay. The last question for you about the book. Barbara Brown Taylor endorsed this. Oh, and I got such a kick out of watching you fangirl over her. I just love it. I love the humanity of people so much. Tell me what her work has meant to you. Barbara Brown Taylor, I mean, is incredible. Like, I mean, just any of us who have read anything of hers. I mean, she has a huge body of work. Yeah. One of the best preachers of all time. But I think one of the things that really mattered to me when my kids were really little, so maybe 15, 17 years ago, I remember reading her books, An Altar in the World and Leaving Church. And I dog-eared and underlined and wept over, but it felt like when I read her book, Learning to Walk in the Dark. Yes, it's my favorite one. She talks about how there are solar Christians that exist in the world, like those of us who were discipled in kind of like this narrative of like victory and certainty. And I was like, well, that's my camp, right? Yep. And she talked about how we needed to like embrace this more lunar side of our faith, the darkness, the loneliness, that it's not inherently bad, that it's not inherently broken or wrong just because it's night or it's winter or whatever metaphor you want to use. Yeah. And that for me felt like it almost was like a dislocated shoulder that got popped back into place. Okay. In some way. Yeah. Right. And I regained full use of my spirituality. Like at that point of being like, there's actually room for this. There's a room for loving the world. There's a room for loving God. There's a room for questions. There's a room for loving my Bible again. Yeah. Even if the way that I read it is 100% different than how I read it 20 or 25 years ago, I love it more now. because of that experience of deconstruction and because of that very wrestling that people scared me off of or tried to call a slippery slope.
Because you don't have to ignore the dark and the scary parts.
Gosh, there's always an invitation from the spirit here.
Yeah.
I mean, good heavens, right? And so there's this sense for me with Barbara's work of just like healing. And I think it ministered a lot of healing to me. When our paths first crossed it was soon after Rachel passed away. And she was so steady and so kind behind the scenes. And I witnessed, it probably took me 2 years, Kristen, to start to be a person around Barbara, because I was just so like, I can't even talk to you because I love you so much. Like,
yes.
And there was this thing of like, okay, if there's someone I want to be when I grow up, it probably would be Barbara.
Yeah.
But in those years since then, she's just been a faithful friend. And she's even better, I think, than people would maybe know or understand. And just her ability to be curious and interested in people. There's not a time I don't call her that she's not like full up with something that she's learning about or interested in. I mean, she'll sit and talk to anybody for hours and just ask them question after question and never volunteer, kind of like to take center stage or, to put on a soliloquy of her wisdom and brilliance, even though she shouldn't good. It just is really incredible. So getting an endorsement like that for the book from Barbara did in fact lay me out.
Yes.
I can play it cool, but we both know I'm not.
I love it. Listen, I am all about like, let us forever have no chill when we meet the people that inspire us and amaze us. And like, God, can we all have the opportunity to let people know,
Exactly. We're just
going to over each other for life.
Let the earnest, sincere freak flag fly at full mast. That's what we're going to do. It's cringy because it could be.
False humility is for the prideful. Actually, we don't need that here.
Listen, that'll preach.
Well, thank you so much. This has truly been a delight. We will link everything up, all your books, your website, Evolving Faith. If people want to get involved with that, what's the best way?
They could just go over to evolvingfaith.com. We have like a gathering usually every year, sometimes every other year. But we also have a full online community of like 10 or 11,000 people who are just there chatting and
awesome.
Talking through questions and sharing information and things along the way too. So it's a really lovely little community. And there's a podcast, a couple seasons, although that's on hiatus right now.
That's all right. Seasons.
Yeah, this is true. I haven't had the heart since Jeff left. So that's all.
I get it. Well, thank you again. This has been a delight.
Oh, thank you so much, Kristen. I've really enjoyed it. I appreciate your hospitality and kindness.
Oh. Do you not just adore her? That conversation felt like a hug that I didn't know I needed. And in my experience, Sarah's words always feel that way. So I'm so grateful that I had this opportunity to tell her what an impact her words have had on my life, my ministry, and even Mosaic as a church. If you find yourself lost, confused, or wandering, I want to leave you with this last truth from Field Notes for the Wilderness. Sarah writes, Jesus doesn't judge the burdened one for the burden, or the sad one for the sadness, or the disappointed one for the disappointment, or the brokenhearted one for the grief. Rather, there is a tenderness to Jesus's words here. God acknowledges and even blesses your weariness. It turns out that yes, the yoke has been too heavy, and it's not all in your head. If you need a community that's not afraid of your doubts or your questions, or you need a place where you feel like you can show up and belong, even if you don't really even know who you are or what you believe right now, please check us out at mosaicchurch.tv. If you're local, we'd love to welcome you in person, but if you're not, we'd love for you to join our online community. Don't forget to leave a review for Becoming Church on Apple Podcasts before March 10th, so you can be entered to win that Amazon gift card. Your review provides even more credibility to the ministry we're doing through these conversations, and it really does help other people find the show so they can be challenged and encouraged the same way you have as you've listened. Until next time, keep becoming church to the people around you.